Subscribe to The Honest Critique for current affairs, movie, book, and product reviews. Also, make sure you press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video. The views, information, or opinions expressed during the video series are solely those of the individuals and do not necessarily represent those of The Honest Critique and its employees. The following video contains strong language which may be offensive to some viewers. Viewer discretion advised.
So Professor Harsh Pant is the Director, Studies and Head of the Strategic Studies Program at Observer Research Foundation. He holds a joint appointment with the Department of Defense Studies and King's India Institute as Professor of International Relations at King's College London. He is also non-resident fellow with Wadhwani Chair in US-India Policy Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Washington, DC. Professor has also been a visiting professor at the Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore, a visiting fellow at the Center for Advanced Study of India, University of Pennsylvania, and he has been a visiting scholar at the Center for International Peace and Security Studies. And the other colleagues include University of Melbourne, University of McGill, and Professor's current research is focused on nation security studies, and his most recent books include New Directions in India's Foreign Policy and India's Nuclear Policy, among the various other books on foreign policy and strategic affairs. So thank you so much, sir, for being here.
Thank you for having me, and it's wonderful to be talking to youngsters on a question that I think is on a topic that is very important at the moment, but I think it's going to be even more important going forward. So I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you so much
for this discussion.
Yeah. So Siddhant, why don't you start?
So let's start with discussing exactly, sir, what do we know about the whole standoff and what do we not know about the standoff? There are multiple stories that are emerging day by day, and these stories seems to be very contradictory in nature with each other. So the principal questions remain unanswered, and there are many misconceptions about the whole border standoff that we are facing with India and China. Can you give us an idea about how much do we exactly know and what is the ground situation as we speak?
See, I think a number of these accounts are obviously an attempt by the two sides, and I would say in particular by the Chinese side, to shape the narrative. So therefore, a lot of the information that you are getting and you will continue to get, as you put it, is going to be contradictory, is going to be difficult to assess, and it's going to be very difficult for us to make independent assessments as ordinary citizens of this country. Because clearly we need a degree of information that is not there in the public domain. But I think broadly what we know is, as the situation is unfolded along the border, is more or less on a track that we increasingly now understand what has happened. So first of all, it is important for your viewers to know that this is, as far as India is concerned, this is an undemarcated border around 4,000 kilometers with China that we have. We call it line of actual control. This is something that that has been a legacy, historical legacy for India. As far as India is concerned, there is no dispute, by the way. It's all Chinese have come in and taken our territory. So there is no legal, as far as India is concerned, there is no dispute here. The matter is that Chinese should vacate these lands. Now, of course, practically now it's going to be difficult to make that case. So the attempt had been historically to try to map out this long boundary, which has three sectors: Eastern, Middle, and Western. And along all these sectors, there have been challenges between China and India. Both differ in their perceptions of where the LAC is. And so transgressions into what each other's perceive to be their territory is very natural, has been very natural. It has been occurring for decades. Sometimes Indian soldiers went into territory and Chinese say, look, this is our territory, you go back. Sometimes Chinese come to our side and we tell them, and there are standard operating procedures to do that. You use banners, you use certain other exercises. At times it has been, or even, you have seen Indian and Chinese soldiers jostling with each other physically in several videos that have emerged. What I think has happened since May this year, of course, that the transgressions have become more potent in the last few years, ever since Mr. Xi came to power, Xi Jinping. We have seen that every year since 2013, we have been seeing major conflicts, major episodes of transgressions happening, and gradually escalating. So from 2013 to 2017, you had the Doklam crisis. That was a major escalation. Although it was slightly different, it was at the tri-junction of India, China, and Bhutan. But what has, over a period of time, this escalation has increased, the Chinese aggression has increased, Chinese assertiveness has increased, and this May, early May, reports emerged that Indians and the Chinese are engaging each other at a number of fronts. So there were, Hot Springs area, there was Galwan Valley area, there was Pangong Tso area. So you had multiple areas, even in Sikkim, Nakula, for example, was also something that was contested, and there were Chinese and Indian soldiers jostling with each other. Indian position in India, the standard operating procedure under these circumstances is that local commanders are allowed to defuse the situation. So you, as per India's confidence building measures that India has signed, as per as the treaties that India has signed with China, local commanders take the initiative and try to defuse the situation. In May, the crisis seemed not to be under the control of local commanders, and therefore senior military leadership had to be called in. So they started negotiating, and at one point in early June, it seemed that the crisis is de-escalating. The two senior leaders, the two senior military officials, their negotiations were more positive, and it seemed as if both sides had agreed on disengagement, gradual disengagement. But suddenly on the night of June 15th, this month, the violence happened in the Galwan Valley, and leading to the killing of 20 Indian soldiers and an unconfirmed number of Chinese soldiers. That episode, in some ways, is quite remarkable, because this is the first time that we have seen casualties on this border since 1970s. This is the first time that we know that Chinese and Indian soldiers have died. China has not accepted. The Chinese have not given the numbers. They have not given the names. But there is enough evidence to suggest that there have been some casualties on that side of the border as well. And the Indian side, of course, 20 Indian soldiers died, and many were many got injured. And it was very brutal fight. It was very the kind of instruments that were used. It seemed that the Chinese came prepared for this kind of fight, and there is enough evidence to suggest that the Chinese not only came prepared, but they also could ask for reinforcement, which Indians could not. So clearly the balance of power on the border was quite in Chinese favor, and it was again a surprise for India. Now, what is interesting, and I think where your question actually comes into play, is that there is an interesting discussion about what exactly happened. Whether the Chinese came to our side of the border and we pushed them back, or we wanted to dismantle a particular construction that the Chinese had created, and we crossed the LAC, our soldiers crossed the LAC and successfully demolished that infrastructure, that construction, and in the process got involved in this fight. So whatever happened, the reality is that that violence happened, and the mobilization on the border has been quite significant from both sides. Of course, Chinese have been ramping up for some time. India started ramping up recently. So the border remains very hot. Border remains, of course, it's a contested border as it is. But now with the forces mobilizing there, this is a real situation which can escalate at any point.
Sir, you mentioned about the Doklam crisis, and we have been facing some of the other skirmishes on the eastern front from the Nathula Pass to the Galwan Valley and the Pangong Tso Lake region. Let's go back to the episode of the Doklam situation that emerged in 2017, and it has often been called the trouble spot from the Indian perspective as well. So there is a status quo that was not supposed to be altered in the tri-junction area of Bhutan, India, and China, which was the Doklam region. And it was said that we had diplomatic channels that were emerging those days, and through those diplomatic channels, we somehow managed to slow down the process, slow down the issue, and maintain the status quo again. So, what are the lessons that we took from the Doklam crisis in 2017, and how much relevant is it to be discussed right now?
Well, Doklam crisis was very significant because that was again after a long time that Chinese and Indian forces came almost eyeball to eyeball, very close to a confrontation, and but it was slightly different as well because it was in a third party. It was happening in Bhutan, at the tri-junction, as you call it, and it was happening. China was building a road which in Bhutan that Bhutanese thought contravenes the status quo and challenges the status quo, and they asked for India's help. India went to help Bhutan in this endeavor. So it was slightly different because Indians and the Chinese were not standing eyeball to, were not actually squaring off each other on Sino-Indian border. It's a tri-junction area where the third party like Bhutan is also involved. But the way it escalated and the way the Chinese played their hand in that crisis, I think from that, Chinese have learned one lesson, that they need to keep the decibel level down. Because in that crisis, Chinese media was all over the place. Chinese media was haranguing India, challenging India that they will teach India a lesson. They will make sure that this is 1962 once again, and so on and so forth. And ultimately, it got resolved through diplomatic means. Ultimately, it got resolved because there was a BRICS summit meeting that was about to happen, and India made it very clear that diplomatic relations cannot continue if this engagement does not end. And so you had a situation where diplomatically the management, it could be resolved. And post Doklam, if you recall, Mr. Modi, Indian Prime Minister, decided that he needed new mechanisms to deal with China. So you have the start of informal summits. So we have had two informal summits so far, one in Wuhan and one in Mamlapuram in Tamil Nadu last year, Chennai. Connect, that it was called, and Wuhan Spirit. So you had that element where the two leaders came together face to face, and in Wuhan again decided that they should not allow problems on the border to overshadow their bilateral engagement. And I think what has happened in Galwan Valley on June the 15th is so dramatic that it fundamentally alters Sino-Indian relationship. It fundamentally alters the assumptions that underlying Sino-Indian relationship. And the most important assumption there is that India and China can continue to engage with each other bilaterally on multiple fronts. It can trade, culture, people to people, academic, all of that can continue, even as bilateral engagement on border issue continues on a parallel track. So border issue, it is important, but it should not be allowed to overshadow the relationship. But that assumption has been found wanting. That rationale for Sino-Indian engagement, I don't think holds any ground today. And therefore, India will have to come out with a different set of response, given the challenge that it finds in articulating a new framework for its China policy.
So there are certain images that have emerged, and various news channels have been putting out these images, satellite images, showing that there were troops near the Galwan Valley River that was used as a launch pad on the 15th. Later on, while the image moves on to the later dates, we find the pose or the images show that the Chinese troops weren't there post 15 or 16, post 17 or 18. So this has been used by a lot of news channels as a victory or a retaliation by the Indian forces. How do you see that? Do you think it's what they're claiming it's true in any sense, or is it just because of the military talks that China has decided to move the military a bit away from the Wadhwani Valley River?
See, I think whatever imagery that you are getting at the moment, I find it very difficult to assess because I don't have any credible way of either checking the source or their interpretation. Everyone is doing it in a very politicized atmosphere. Those who have been critical of this government, they want to prove that Modi is very weak. He could not manage China. He has been a failure. Those who want to support Mr. Modi, they are reading into it, oh, it's an Indian victory. I think at this point, it's very difficult to say what is happening on the border. There are some images that, of course, there are germane to the conversation. And those images show build up on both sides of the LAC. Those images show build up is happening on both sides of the LAC. Those images show that China has now developed done a lot of investment in building infrastructure on its side of the border. India has been a late starter, but India is now ramping up its military profile in the region. Now, so the point, I think the larger point that I want to make here is that, look, whatever has happened along the border this time has as much to do with China as it has to do with India. It has to do with India because India today is in a much better position on the border. Indian infrastructure is much more efficient. India has built roads, the Darbuk-Shiok Dolot-Begoldi road, which 255 kilometers all-weather road, which is a very strategic road, very important road for India, connecting Leh in Ladakh to the Karakoram Pass, that fundamentally alters India's ability to project power along the LAC. Therefore, Chinese are objecting to this construction very, very vociferously. China doesn't want this construction to happen because it, over a period of time, will challenge China's superiority along the border. So, let us recognize the fact that for decades along the border, China was the stronger party because on its side of the LAC, China has built remarkable infrastructure. China has done a lot of work in building roads, in building other aspects of its infrastructure. It is only now that India is catching up. And that is something that allows India to project power, to push its forces. Chinese forces today find Indian forces in places where they had not seen before. So suddenly they realize that something is happening. And therefore there is pressure on China to do a preemptive move vis-a-vis India's construction, vis-a-vis India's power projection. So there is going to be, that's why my argument was that there is going to be turbulence along this border for the foreseeable future, unless we find a permanent solution to the boundary problem. Because India will continue to do what it is doing. After all, India is not going to go back and say, all right, China has objected, we are not going to build any more roads. In fact, India has expedited the construction of its roads. India is going to build those roads. China will continue construction on its side of the border. There's going to be push, both sides, both sides will be pushing along the LAC and to see how far you can push the other side. So this contestation is now ingrained in the way both sides look at the boundary issue. And therefore, so long as India was the weaker party, content with taking a back seat, Chinese were happy. Now, India is also muscling up. India is also saying that, look, you need to go back and we will fight it out. The challenges are becoming more and more on our face. It's coming more and more explicit. And I don't think that we have any mechanism to resolve it because, as I was discussing earlier with Siddhant, we have tried both formal mechanisms, treaties, etc. They have not worked. In fact, this episode that has happened, it shows that none of those treaty mechanisms were able to restrict China's ability to alter the status quo on the LAC. Similarly, Mr. Modi's attempt to have informal mechanisms has also not worked. So clearly, we are at a loss in terms of mechanisms.
It's kind of remarkable how you broke down the whole process in which we have been facing skirmishes along the LAC, and you also mentioned about the Darbuk-Shiok Daulat-Begoldi road, or the DSDBO as we call it, which goes to Despang, which is of higher relevance in terms of strategic gains. So now what we are seeing from the reports is that the DSDBO is being now overlooked by PLA after strategic gains in the Galwan River Valley. How much true is that, and what is the Indian response to this? Because if there is a territory loss from the Indian side, how are we going to combat that situation, first of all? And secondly, how much importance that the DSDVO holds in terms of Galwan River Valley strong location?
Well, it is fundamental. That's why we are building it, and that's why we are pushing ahead with it, and that's why we are taking so much risk. I think it's fundamental to our security and strategic understanding of the region, and that road needs to be built. That road allows India to position itself very favorably along the border, and it allows India, to push Chinese claims a bit back, a bit forward along the backward along the LAC. So clearly there is there is an imperative to get that road done, and India has already done it. There are tertiary areas that need to be done, but I think the main central element of it has already been completed. And there is a reason why Chinese are pushing against it. Therefore, they are creating this crisis. So clearly, both sides see it as very, very important. India doesn't want to give an inch on this issue. Chinese want this project to be cancelled and almost a red line to be drawn for India. But that's the reason why this crisis has emerged in the first place. So it's clearly very important for India. It's clearly very important for China. Now the question is, as you point out, that there are suggestions that Chinese, has taken positions. Chinese forces have taken positions along the heights there in the Galwan Valley, so they can look down into what is happening, and that gives them strategic advantage. I think that's still, to be, yes, certainly I think Chinese have improved their ability to restrict India's, maneuvers in the region. But India still holds territorial advantages that the Chinese do not, geographical advantages in the region that the Chinese do not. So my sense is that it would be, we will have to wait and assess it before coming to a definitive conclusion whether or not the balance of power has, and how the balance of power has changed. Certainly, Chinese are coming there in full force. Certainly, Chinese have built their infrastructure there because they believe that it is very important to restrict India's ability to shape the region. So they will do everything possible. And I don't think they are in any mood to go back, despite the disengagement talks that we are having. It's not very clear if they are going to dismantle those constructions that they have done, the facilities that they've created, and withdraw even further. It's unlikely that what they have gained, they will give up so easily. So I think India will have to be there for the long haul. And there is a reason why you see so much military buildup happening from the Indian side. After all, India is also positioning its air force there, projecting air power there, because there is a reason why, in response to what Chinese are doing. So clearly, the larger strategic architecture in the region is changing very, very rapidly. And therefore, the point that again I made is that the militarization of LAC is a reality today. And we should not expect that militarization is going to go away anytime soon, because none of the two sides has any incentive to withdraw their claims. Because if India withdraws it today, what's the guarantee that the Chinese will not fill the vacuum? And what is the incentive for India to trust China today? After all, China has broken every single treaty that it has signed with India, every single tenet of the treaty. So there is no incentive to trust the Chinese. And therefore, for both sides, it is very, very important to maintain the current posture. And my sense is that it's going to be very challenging going forward to push back from that maximalist position that the two sides have taken.
Okay.
Sure.
So you mentioned about pursuing status quo ante with China, and there are many potential infrastructure that we have started building up, even though we were a little bit slow on our pace compared to the Chinese side. But now slowly we are trying to catch up with the Chinese side as well. So pursuing status quo ante with China will lead to a potential conflict, which will involve pushing them back militarily. What are your views on that? Will that lead to a potential conflict, or the situation will remain even less, or we can possibly de-escalate the whole scenario?
Siddhant, I didn't quite catch your question. So are you saying building infrastructure on the border?
No, not that, sir. So you mentioned about building infrastructure on the border and how we are trying to catch up with the Chinese side as well, because our pace of development has been pretty slow compared to the Chinese side, and we are trying to catch up and muscling up in the whole LAC region. But at the same time, we are trying to pursue status quo ante with China, and there is a assessment which says pursuing status quo with China will lead to a potential conflict, which will involve pushing them back militarily in military manners. So, what are your views on that, and how will that going to affect it? Is it going to de-escalate the situation, or is it going to create a even bigger crisis, or it will possibly lead to a full-scale conflict?
See, I think in some ways the India would certainly like that the status quo as it existed on as it existed in April, that status quo should be restored by the Chinese. And China, having made certain gains, would be loath to give up those gains, if at all, certain gains have been made in certain sectors. Now, at this point, it's unclear exactly what gains Chinese have made. There have been some contrasting. There have been a lot of debate in India about whether Chinese have really entered or are holding ground that they were not holding, say in April. There's this new ground that they are holding. So we really don't know. See, because China's approach on territorial questions is one of salami slicing. So they have been doing this for decades now. And this is not simply with India. This is also the modus operandi that they've followed in South China Sea. They move gradually. They hold some new ground. Others think that it's not that important, and suddenly it becomes the new LAC. So that is, if that is what people are talking about, and that has been happening in India for decades. The Chinese have been moving in, then we have been pushing them back, but they've not been restored, going back to the status quo ante. So in that sense, the ground realities have been changing gradually, bit by bit, they have taken over Indian territory, much like they have taken over the territories in its maritime territory and other territory in other areas, including the South China Sea. So I think, the idea of where the LAC is and how do you justifiably make LAC permanent international border, that is a challenge for India, and therefore, in my opinion, it should be done as soon as possible, because the costs for India are only going to rise given China's and given the growth, given the power differential between India and China. So India has to be very cognizant of that reality, and of course, at the moment, you have to draw a line somewhere. So what India's lines are today remains very firm, that as of today, India would like Chinese forces to go back to the April status. So the status quo ante should be restored, by which India means that where Chinese forces were in April, that is where they should be now. Whether or not Chinese do it remains to be seen, and therefore India's holding of that red line would mean certain costs on India. It can be military costs, it can be diplomatic costs, but I think that's a red line that India increasingly seems willing to hold, because if India does not hold that line, then we don't know what really will come next.
Perfect.
So before the Doklam crisis, or we can say the Doklam conflict, there was another instance where Dalai Lama, the spiritual leader of the Tibetan Buddhist monastery, often seen as not a spiritual but a political leader in China because of the entire Tibet issue. This was 2017, and 8th April, when Dalai Lama visited the state of Arunachal Pradesh, which China sees as South Tibet. There's this issue with the McMahon line, which China settled a dispute with Myanmar on the same line, but it doesn't solve the dispute with India on a similar line. So do you think this escalation that took place in the border flared up because of certain events. Also in 2017, which I'm talking about, the visit of Dalai Lama to a land which is contested according to the Chinese boundary.
Well, Dalai Lama has been in India now for decades. Now, Dalai Lama does certain things in India. Dalai Lama is widely considered to be a spiritual leader by not simply Tibetans, but also a lot of Indians. So his presence or lack of presence in India cannot be an excuse for China to start, unilaterally drawing up its LAC. The problem today, what China is doing is that China is claiming parts of LAC which it had never claimed in the past. So I don't think that today's behavior of China can be related to what Dalai Lama does or does not do in India. Dalai Lama's problem, yes, of course, Dalai Lama is in India. The Chinese view him with suspicion. We have our own, we have tried to navigate that for decades now. And India has made a case that, look, in any case, India has never said that Tibet should be an independent country. Even Dalai Lama never says that Tibet should be an independent country. He wants autonomy as far as Tibetans are concerned and their culture and other values are concerned. And India has always argued that Tibet is part of China. We follow one China policy. So in a sense, that cannot be a rationale for China to start altering the status quo on the border. And China, of course, let us be honest that this is a border that that has been undemarcated for long, but it continues to be relatively peaceful. We have not had major confrontation on these borders, as I said, since 1970s. So clearly something is altering somewhere, where other actors, where something else is driving Chinese behavior and Chinese proclivity to change LAC, to change the parameters or framework on which negotiations can happen, has to do with something else. And as we were discussing, it may have to do with India's own growing potency on the border. It may have to do with China's own internal problems. But whatever it is, I don't think it can be related to Dalai Lama or his presence in India.
Okay, so as we speak, there are many developments also happening right now in Ladakh Valley. A couple of days back, we heard about the staff flag meetings between the Chinese and the Indian military wings, and some of to the level of Major General and Lieutenant General, the corps commander level talks. So what are the developments that we can expect out of it? What are the results that we can expect out of these channels, these military channels? Because I think diplomatic channels have been put on hold, and this is now a complete military issue, if I'm not wrong. So how do we explore that option? What do we expect out of such conversations on the military front?
The negotiations that are happening at senior commander level, military officials level, are happening because the standard mechanisms have broken down. The standard operating procedures used to be related to local commanders. If there is a crisis in any part of the LAC, local commanders used to sit with each other, with their counterpart, and discuss disengagement or discuss de-escalation. Now that is not happening because the crisis has escalated at the local level, and the senior military leadership on both sides is coming to action. We know that the previous, when these negotiations happened the first time, the results were not very good because clearly the result was that after these negotiations on July, I think July 6th or 7th, these talks happened, and July 15th, the episode of Galwan Valley happened. Now, I think after Galwan Valley, we have again seen the two military leaders talking. Corps commander level meetings are happening. We are told that they have been successful, that there is a process of de-escalation will happen. Disengagement will happen, gradual disengagement will happen. It will happen also, a de-escalation, a disengagement which is verifiable. So India is now insisting on verifiability of disengagement. I am not very sure how effective these can be, given that as I said earlier, it seems to me that trusting China at face value today is a very difficult option. Unless China and Chinese forces really pull backwards and demolish some of the structures that they have built, I don't think the intent can be conveyed to India that they are positive about disengagement, because they can talk about disengagement and at the same time prepare for a conflict. And I think Indians are taking that into account, because by all whatever information we have, we know that India is building up military on the border. There is military ramp up happening on the border. All the three services are engaged there, and there is a considerable ramping up of pressure on the border as well. So we are not, I don't think India should, and India is taking it at face value, because clearly the trust factor is missing in the relationship at the moment.
So I have a bit more diplomatic question for you, which is, there's an aggressive anti-China lobby in India, which would want India to adopt a more aggressive posture towards Beijing and join hands with the United States and the EU in countering the growing Chinese influence. Do you see any merit in this view? And I have just one more question for you. It's that we have seen that even though there have been occasional skirmishes between India and China, however, we have maintained a friendly relation between trade in the country, between the two countries. Do you think these recent skirmishes might be one of the other ways we think that the Indo-China relationship with the trade relation is also under stress?
So I didn't catch the entire part of your second part of your question fully. You mean that question is about trade relations?
Yeah, trade relations. We have maintained trade relations for a long time, even though with occasional skirmishes. Do you think with this recent skirmish around the border, the trade relation between the two countries is also under stress right now?
Yeah. So on lobbies, see, India is a democracy, and all democracies have lobbies. There are pressure groups, there are interest groups. If there are anti-China groups in India, there are pro-China groups in India as well. You have Indian newspapers that are allowed to publish Chinese state media. So there are many newspapers which will carry stuff from Global Times or from Chinese media, which is basically a propaganda arm of the Chinese Communist Party. So we have everything in this country. We have pro-China groups, we have anti-China groups, which is how it should be, I think, in a democracy, or you should be allowed to reflect your views, and if you want to organize around them, you can organize around them. After all, this is a country that continues to have communist parties in India, communist parties that have been that was often sided with the Chinese even in 1962 war. So I think this is this is quite remarkable. Only in India this will happen. So I don't think that lobby, the anti-China lobby in and of itself can create that kind of a mood in this country. China, I would say, if there is anyone to be blamed for the anti-China sentiment today, it is China itself. China has China has created an atmosphere in this country where even the communist parties would find it very difficult to publicly stand up and say, let's have good ties with China. The environment has become so hostile, and China has to be blamed for it. I mean, in a sense, if you see what Chinese have been doing to India, have been doing to Indian foreign policy, supporting Pakistan, and not helping India in the UN Security Council, not helping India become part of the NSG, then creating China-Pakistan economic corridor in territory which India considers its own, and then of course continuing these pressure points on the boundary. So one after another, you have had things where India has been put on the back foot. And despite that, India has, if you look at, even what we were talking about earlier, all governments have tried to maintain very cordial relations with China. Mr. Modi started the informal dialogue process. So I don't, I think the ability of any particular lobby to shape Indian foreign policy might be might be an exaggeration, might be overrated. I think in the end, if India's foreign policy choices become anti-Chinese in orientation, it will be thanks to Chinese policies themselves. And this particular episode has completely, exposed in some ways China, and has put tremendous pressure on a government that would have otherwise liked to have stable ties with China. The other question is about trade, and trade again, then this is related to it. Look, trade, traditionally, what do we understand? The argument is that let's have trade with countries so that we can have good relations. Now, trade allows constituencies to develop, trade allows engagement with the other side to grow, and that perhaps leads to better relationships. But with China, interestingly, what we have seen is that the more they trade, they also become more they also generate negative hostilities. So, I mean, if you think about it, Japan and China, they are, China is Japan's largest trading partner, yet look at their political relationship. America and China, two of the biggest economies, extremely intertwined, look at their relationship. India, of course, is a very small country in terms of trade. Chinese, I think, are only, Chinese exports to India is largely hardly 3% of Chinese worldwide exports. So India is a very small part of the Chinese global trade engagement. But even here, we have had problems, not simply now that people are just getting very excited and saying let's ban Chinese products, etc. But the issue of trade deficit, that one of the problems that we have seen with China is that China does not play by the rules. Now, what do you do with a country that does not want to play by the rules? You have border agreements, you don't take on the border agreements. A country like Philippines takes you to court, international court. You say that you don't want to abide by the court's judgment. On trade, you don't give reciprocal concessions to countries. Under the WTO, you should be giving market access to countries, but you don't give market access to countries. So what Chinese have done, in some ways, Mr. Trump is right, that Chinese have exploited the global trading environment to their advantage. They've taken away what they want to, in areas where they wanted to have successes, where they wanted to have advantages, they have made sure they got those advantages. And in areas where they had to give access to other countries, they have not given access to other countries. So India does not get access. What are India's strengths on trade? Our professional services, our pharmaceuticals, our information technology. These areas are forbidden in China. We don't have any market access to these areas. So in some ways, we lack the ability to shape Chinese behavior, whereas China can shape our behavior. So as I was saying, look, I love the fact that we are a democracy, and I wouldn't want to live in any country which is not a democracy. But look at the consequences that happen. That the advantages that you get that even a country like China gets in India, where you will have your mainstream newspapers carry Chinese propaganda as news items. Can we do this in China? Can any newspaper, can any government agency put ads in Chinese newspapers? Can we approach China in the same way as Chinese approach India? So they exploit the environment that they get, whether it is Western democracies, whether it is India. They exploit that democracy to their advantage. They play it around. There is a reason why all major democracies in the world are ganging up, because you have a problem. Look at Australians, poor Australians. They thought that they had great trade relations with China, but China used their democratic framework, intervened in their domestic politics, and by funding, by covert operations, they have created a network which now the Australians are recognizing has become a challenge to their democracy as well. So I think the whole modus operandi of China is very problematic, and therefore the issue is that when it comes to trade, or when it comes to larger issue of how much access should China have in India or in any democracy, it's a very important question. And I think there is a reason why this question is getting more traction today than it was getting, say, 5 years back, because Chinese actions, Chinese engagement with the world has become so much more complicated in the last few years. And the world is recognizing the challenge.
Yeah. So I just have a small follow-up with that. So we have always believed Russia to be our good old friend. But if you look with relations to trade in the country, with China especially, Russia shares about $110 billion trade, which is far lesser than what India shares with Russia. So if there's a lobby, or if you can say a group that comes, that gangs against China, can India expect Russia's help in any format? Because we saw what happened a few days back. So Russia gave a very diplomatic stand on the entire issue.
See, I don't think any country, it can be Russia, it can be United States, is going to pull our chestnuts out of the fire when it comes to China. India, at the end of the day, will have to fight its own battles. India, at the end of the day, will find that all countries have their own equations with China, which they will be very loath to dismantle. Now, today there is a news report that the US Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, has said that Americans are moving forces in Asia because China is challenging India and Southeast Asia. Now, it's very nice of Mr. Pompeo to say that, but America is not moving forces here because they want to protect India. They are moving their forces here because they have their own agenda when it comes to China. They want to tackle China. They want to put pressure on China. They want to show, Mr. Trump wants to show to his domestic population that he's a strong leader who can take on China. So they are not doing it for India. Similarly, Russians will not do anything for India. They will do it for their own interest. If they have an interest in converging with India, they will converge. If they feel that their equities are much stronger with China, which they have become stronger, as you point out, given that for Russia, the primary point of contestation is with the West, and China helps Russia in that endeavor. So they will certainly take the diplomatic route that you have suggested. So I don't think we should be emotional about our relationships. We should be pragmatic about them. All our relationships are based on interest. All our relationships are based on pragmatic, engagement with the other countries. And those countries will respond. Those countries will react to these developments as they deem fit in the light of certain circumstances. It's not a love affair. We are not going to get married, and we are not going to have a relationship, all our lives. It's the best thing that I often like to sort of talk about is look at China. We criticize China, but there's much that is to be learned here. They are very nimble. What did they do? They started off, during the Cold War with great pals with the Soviet Union. 1970s, they broke off the Sino-Soviet alliance, moved into the American camp, Nixon opening, Kissinger's opening. They exploited America. They exploited the Western system of global governance to their advantage. Now the West is criticizing the Chinese that, look, you have exploited the system. But so what, they would say. We did what we deemed best in our interest. We use that to become more powerful in the international system. And that's, I think, that nimbleness is very important in geopolitics. If you want to play a higher stakes game, and I think Chinese, they play higher stakes game. Their energy is devoted towards making China a great power because they want that century of humiliation that they think they have suffered to be overcome by this, and they have played every possible geopolitical game that is available. So their movement is very flexible. They're not emotional about it. They think that if America is today helping us, let's take help from America. Tomorrow Russians will help us. We will take help from America, from the Russians. And I think in some ways, perhaps India can also be like that. I don't know whether it is possible for us in the short term, but certainly in the long term, we will have to look more pragmatically about what every country does for us. We can't perpetually be asking this question of, with America, we often ask this question. Whenever there is a discussion about America, the question comes, can we trust Americans? Now that is, I think that is beside the point. We are not here to, enter into a love affair with the Americans. We are here to pragmatically engage them, to make use of them. Similarly, they will make use of us and they will get back. So we have to be a bit more articulate in terms of what we want from a relationship, how we want to use it, because international relations, politics is a ruthless business. If you want to play this game, be ruthless. If you don't want to play this game, be a country like Switzerland. Happy, small, neutral. No one cares what Switzerland says and does in the world, but they are happy about it. But we want everything. We want everyone to love us. We also want to become a great power. Both cannot come together. If you want to become a major, if you want to play a major power game, there will be countries that will dislike us. There will be countries that will loathe us. Be ready for it.
So what you're saying gives me a sense of what Dr. Tharoor in fact wrote in his book Pax Indica, that it's time for India to move away from the non-alignment, the theory of non-alignment, and to move something called multi-alignment, and to engage with multiple actors with different aspects on foreign policy. Do you think this is the future for foreign policy, with multi-alignment?
Well, I think in the last few years, we have seen this articulated differently, but we have seen as Indian Foreign Secretary, Indian External Affairs Minister, both talking about issue-based alignment, that India is ready to align with everyone on issues. We will not align, the days of non-alignment or days of alignments are gone. Alignments will happen, coalitions will be formed, but they will be ad hoc. They'll be based on issues wherever we have issues which are convergent, we will move towards them. So, often, the evidence that is presented for it is that, look, India is engaging with countries like Japan, Australia, America, in managing the Indo-Pacific, the famous Quad, the quadrilateral group of countries. On the other hand, India also used to engage, at least till recently, even earlier this week, the Russia-China-India trilateral that happened. And that there you discuss multilateralism. There you discuss how global economic order can be created at a time when America, for example, is running away from economic globalization. But I think even that has its limits, because now, can you really expect anyone in India to believe that you can have a proper, even an issue-based alignment with China? How will that work? So I think Chinese behavior, therefore, I want to underscore, Chinese behavior has made it almost impossible for India to have a normal relationship with China, much as it would want it to be normal. Because that is something that China has now made it practically impossible. You cannot, and therefore, when this week, when the RIC happened, the Russia-India-China trilateral happened, Indian Foreign Minister, Indian External Affairs Minister, made a very pointed remark. He said, norms and principles are all right, but what we want to see is what countries do in operational terms, in practical terms. If countries do not respect each other's genuine interests, if countries do not respect international law, if countries do not respect what other countries feel very strongly about, then the potential for global disorder increases. Then we cannot create a global order. So I think India is increasingly being pushed in directions by Chinese behavior, which it would rather not go. But the alternatives are very limited. So I think, I'm sure, non-alignment is something that is, that again, I think there is a lot of, there's a big constituency in this country that has continued to argue that, look, we have to be equidistant from China and the US. Now, if you are not an ideological thinker, if you are an ordinary citizen, forget all your training as an IR person, or forget all your training as an academic. Just if you are an ordinary Indian citizen, does this statement make sense to you today, in today's world, that can we be equidistant from China and America today? No, we can't. That's a reality. So clearly, that argument has its limits. The idea of non-alignment has its limits. The idea of multi-alignment also has its limits in the world today, because clearly you can't align with China on the same terms as you're going to align with America, or you're going to align with other countries, even Russia. So what the point here is that, yes, I think India would like that flexibility to have multiple alignments, but with China, it's a very different ballgame, because China has completely now changed India's calculus with its own behavior.
Now I come to the part where I will be asking you a bit heavy question with a bit loaded one. So, this is one of the favorite questions for a lot of people: the China-Pakistan economic corridor. So, this was in 2017 when China organized One Belt One Road summit in Beijing, and India decided to avoid that summit. But all the SAARC nations, in fact, Japan as well, apart from SAARC nations, Japan and all the other, in fact, US also went. And a part of that OBOR includes the CPEC, and which passes through the contested line between India and Pakistan. So, how do you think Indian Pakistan, like whatever, even with the surgical strikes as well, we have seen China being very reserved because the road passes through the Pakistan occupied Kashmir, which is there. What do you think will be India's reaction towards this road? And do you think is there a solution to come to a mutual ground for this? The other part is India's stand on Balochistan, which is a bit problematic for China because India claiming part of the land there, and India training as well. If we can say insurgents or people out there from Kabul and sending it to Balochistan has its effects as well, and China has taken a strong stand against it as well. What are the two things that you come to this conclusion from this scenario?
Well, there are two things. One, India's stand on BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, is, I think, in my opinion, one of the boldest foreign policy moves that India has made in recent years. India opposed Belt and Road Initiative primarily because of the China-Pakistan economic corridor. India opposed it because it said that this is a matter of sovereignty for India. It passes through the contested territory, and therefore India will have to object to it. There was no other rationale for India's objection. Of course, India's argument was framed also along certain lines, like that certain norms have to be followed. And India argued that Belt and Road Initiative is unilateral. India argued that it is top-down, that it does not take into account the financial and environmental sustainability of these projects. And that is very interesting because when India stood up and made these comments, a lot of the countries said India will be isolated. And if you see the reaction a few years down the line, most other countries have accepted the logic, and the great debate on BRI is exactly what India, on how India had framed that debate. So I think that has been one of the most interesting and successful episodes in Indian foreign policy. And it continues to have reverberations. And I think the animosity between China and India is also partly due to the fact that BRI remains contested, that India continues to oppose it, that India continues to frame it the way it does. And it is Mr. Xi Jinping's vanity project, and therefore the challenge is, how do you, for him in particular, this must be a great affront that India continues to oppose it. Now, what India has been doing in, operationally in Balochistan and CPEC, frankly, I don't know whether that is, that can over a long term prevent the China-Pakistan economic corridor. If China-Pakistan economic corridor fails, it's not because India is trying to do something about it. It's because it's inherently flawed. And if you see recent reports on CPEC, if you see recent analyses on CPEC, it makes it very clear that Chinese investment at the moment is not paying them any dividends. Of course, it passes through Balochistan. There is a lot of domestic political challenge to that. Locals do not feel part of the project. Locals are opposing the project. The way Pakistan has framed it is that it becomes a project which fills the coffers of Chinese military, not doing anything for the project on the, not doing anything for the upliftment of the people on the ground or capacity building of the people. So I think if CPEC fails, it will not be because India wants it to fail or India is doing anything deliberate to make it fail. It is because the realities on the ground are such that it is not going to work, and China might have to reconsider it. But we are still some way off. I think the kind of investment that China has made, China would like to ensure that it succeeds, and China will make sure that it it goes ahead fully with that project, and China will continue to make investments. So therefore, China is very cautious on what is happening there, and China takes it very, very seriously. Yes, you are right that India's statements on and decisions to, for example, revoke Article 370 last year, and India's statements that on CPEC and on the region largely are also factors which perhaps have unnerved China to a certain extent about its own future projects' viabilities.
I think we have covered most of the crucial parts of on the diplomatic front, and now I will just give a little bit of the historical basis to it. So in April 1960, the then Chinese Premier Xu Enlai offered a deal to settle disputes, including the boundary issue with the then Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru. And while this whole skirmish is going on at the LSE, there are many factions in the media within our country that are discussing about the historical relevance and the origin of the conflict, saying that it can be the fault of our previous Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru or the various deals that have taken place. So how do we, where do we find the origin of this conflict? Does it have to do something with the Xu Enlai's Treaty of 1960 proposal/treaty, or it is something to do with the other Chinese motivation that they are having?
Siddhant, you'll have to repeat that question. I missed out parts of it.
Okay, no problem. So I think we have discussed most on the diplomatic front, majorly covered all the topics. And talking about the historical relevance, I would ask you how what is the origin of the whole conflict? Because in April 1960, the Xu Enlai, the then Chinese premier, offered a deal to settle disputes, including the boundary issue, with Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru. And we are still not very much clear about the source of the origin of the conflict. So what is this motivation behind the Chinese side, and what is the historical relevance, and what is the origin of the conflict which is going on in the LSE?
See, the historical part. It would be better if you talk to a historian. I'm not a historian, but clearly the issue here is that, look, there are several interpretations of the 1962 war, and the aspect which we continue. I think the broader point here is that we continue to live under the legacy of that war. And it took India almost 2 generations to get over that war. And to finally begin to treat China as a normal country. And what China has done now in Galwan clearly takes us back, because a lot of the emotions and imagery are primarily about what the 1962 war, and the treachery of China, etc., etc. Now, insofar as the 62 war is concerned, you have various schools of thought in the scholarly writing. You have the Neville Maxwell school of thought, the argument that it was India's fault, Mr. Jawaharlal Nehru's forward policy of pushing the forces forward despite them not having the necessary backup and resources, pushed India into a conflict that India would never have won in any case. And similarly, not taking into account Xu Enlai's proposal in a very realistic terms. The other side is, of course, the narrative that is there, which is that, look, China, Nehru was all about Asian solidarity, Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai, and China stabbed Nehru in the back. that China, instead of resolving this problem, China created situations which led to the conflict. So I think, that debate, that's a scholarly debate, that's about scholarship, that will continue. Some people would argue that Nehru was a realist. He read China right. He could not just manage his resourcing right of the military. Others would argue Nehru was an idealist, and he therefore left, did not give enough importance to the military. And in the end, the result was that his whole woolly-headedness about Asian solidarity, etc., he did not realistically factor in Chinese capabilities and did not develop his own abilities to fight a war with China, resulting in China's victory in that conflict and India's humiliation. But I think the larger point that we as Indians of today need to think about is that whatever the source of that conflict was, that conflict shaped an entire generation of Indian policy thinkers, an entire generation of Indians. You still hear the song Lata Mangeshkar singing "Mere Watan Ke Logo." It's a very patriotic song. It's something that still gets you in the patriotic fervor. And there is a sense that we died just because we had to die, and China was a great betrayal by the Chinese. Now, for China to overcome that in so many decades, for India-China relationship has been quite an achievement. I would say that successive Indian governments have managed to engage China and take Chinese relationship forward in a very pragmatic manner. We are the weakest. We became weaker over a period of time compared to China, and China still today is the bigger party in this dyad. So for India, therefore, conflict cannot be an option. But it also cannot be the other way around, that Chinese would dictate to India and unilaterally unilaterally transform the LAC, unilaterally change the status quo on the LAC, and India would not draw a line. After all, in various conflicts, sometimes, quite a few times, it's the weaker side that has emerged victorious. Chinese themselves got their defeat from Vietnamese, so they know how important it is to get the politics and strategy right. So for India, therefore, now the challenge is, how do you draw the red lines and how do you make sure that those red lines are respected by China?
Yeah. So,
Ratnadeep, I have to go now.
Can I get like 5 more minutes? 5? Okay. So I'll just ask two last questions. One Siddhant will ask, and one I'll ask. It's then done.
Yeah, one question each, sir.
Okay. So Mr. Vijay Gokhale, former Foreign Secretary, has recently written an article in the Hindu pointing out that the Chinese establishment of today has adopted a more aggressive policy compared to the nuanced stances pursued by Zhou Enlai or Deng Xiaoping, and that it would help China if it would help China if it goes back to the older approach. So first, do you see a marked change in China's foreign policy today compared to the 1990s as such? And do you think this change is inevitable because...
Yes.
Because China is now an economic power, and the word use has become more buzzword to describe the new Chinese diplomat. So is this a fair, accurate description of China?
So the first, I'm just repeating, the first part is about Mr. Gokhale and the second part is about wolf warriors.
Yeah, wolf warriors.
Okay. See, China is, of course, China of 2020 is not going to be China of 1990, right? So with due respect to Mr. Gokhale, I think, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
With due respect to Mr. Gokhale, I think Indians should stop giving advice to the Chinese on what to do. If I've not read this piece, but if he's saying that China should ideally go back to their to their 1990s policy, then that's something that is unrequited advice to the Chinese, which Chinese are obviously not going to entertain. That too from an Indian. and that too from an ex-Foreign Secretary of India. So, see, we can believe or we want that China should do this, China should do that, but clearly China has a different set of agenda. I mean, it's clear that they have become more aggressive. It's clear that under Xi Jinping, they believe that their time has come, that they need to project power in ways that perhaps their predecessors think it was right to hide their capabilities. So I frankly am not so sure why why would China not behave like other major powers? See, all major powers throughout history have been like this. Now, the point can be that perhaps China is overplaying its hand. Perhaps China does not have the capabilities and it is doing that. But if they are doing that, then their credibility, their rise in the world will automatically falter. So we don't have to worry about it. If their capabilities and strategies are not in sync with each other, then then their rise will not be a rise. They will not become a major player in global politics, and that's something that will take care of itself. So we don't have to worry about it. What we have to worry about is how do we handle the situation? How do we as a country that can manage China's rise? China is doing what it is doing for its own set of reasons, for its own set of external and domestic reasons. It will continue to do that. What we have to worry about is how we can tackle China and what can we do in the short to medium term to make sure that the power disparity that exists between the two does not result in outcomes that are substantively inferior for India. That is a challenge for us. The second aspect, of course, their diplomats have become very aggressive. The diplomats are, very, the term that you use and has been used for years. There is an aggressiveness in their approach, which was missing earlier. But look, that is something that we used to also blame the American diplomats for. We used to say, oh, American diplomats are very aggressive. They go around the world, tell the world what to do. The Chinese are also doing the same thing. Now, all great powers, all major powers, behave in a similar manner. And we should not expect China to behave any differently. This aggressiveness, this assertiveness will be part of the game for China, part of the behavior, and we have to try to figure out a response to it rather than wondering why are they doing it and should they do it. That's not for us to decide.
So this will be the concluding question, and I think this will be a better way to conclude on multiple fronts. So you're in the previous sections, you have spoken of that disengagement in terms of verifiability is still unclear, considering we can't trust China in many possible ways. So is there a leverage in this whole conflicting relationship between India and China, which can possibly compel China for a potential de-escalation, or can India replicate China's gaining territory approach elsewhere along the LAC and pursue a mutual de-escalation? Will that put us in a favorable position with the same leverage, with at least some leverage in our hand, and finally settle the dispute in some or the other way possible? What are your assessment on this particular point?
See, yes, I think there are areas along the LAC where India has advantages. India has certain critical positions, and India is geographically well placed to take advantage of those areas. And India, I think, should try to see what can be done. But I think at this point, given that the entire LAC is hot, given that both sides have ramped up their presence along the entire LAC, it would be relatively difficult. If ideally this should have been done before, where India could have made gains in some areas where they had advantages, and then try to barter it off with the gains that Chinese have made. But Indians, I think, rarely make offensive, take offensive positions along the LAC. And something I think which is strategically a mistake. India should have been doing that much before this crisis erupted. At the moment, therefore, the leverage issue is relatively serious. We don't have much leverage. Clearly, in the short to medium term. In the long term, we have, we can build relationships, we can do various things, show our displeasure. But we will certainly, we are going to see an escalation in trade where we are going to put China, where we are going to wall off China in certain sectors in India. So that is going to happen, but that's a long-term thing, and it doesn't, again, trade relationship being so skewed, China may not feel an immediate impact. Militarily, the options are limited, apart from the fact that you can certainly escalate it using air power, and you can also use the maritime aspect. So the Indian Ocean can become another theater where interdiction perhaps can happen, and India can think of that. But all of these, all of this would require a level of escalation, which India will have to think very carefully about. How much do we want to escalate? After all, both the countries are nuclear weapon states, and we are fighting a war or whatever, or a limited conflict under the nuclear umbrella. So the questions are very serious. The situation is serious, and options are not that great. And therefore, you see the emphasis on de-escalation. And I would also like to say that it's not that options are so great for the Chinese side. They also don't, I mean, they are sort of, they may be well positioned in some areas, but clearly they also know their limitations. They also know that the Indian army is much better at mountain warfare. They also know that India's abilities to create problems for China has increased. So they are going to be, they are also under pressure. They would not like to fight a war unnecessarily. But what they have is that they have momentum on their side. They have built infrastructure on their side, which is of a much superior quality, despite India catching up. So therefore, they can put pressure on India in ways that perhaps India cannot. And that is something that we need. I think another learning from this episode is that we need to think more strategically. We can't be firefighting all the time. We need to think what will happen 10 years, 20 years down the line when things look different. So planning strategically, I think, has been a deficiency in Indian policy system for very long. And hopefully, if this crisis can wake us up to that reality, that will be good.
Okay. Thank you so much, sir, for taking your time and giving us the interview. Before I let you go, a small task for you, which you love as a professor. Any 3 books which you would like to suggest to our audience to read?
On the India-China?
Anything you like. Probably on India-China, because we spoke about it.
I think everyone should read Kissinger's On China, because that is something that I think is one of his last books, if he doesn't write another one, because that shows how his own thinking on China has evolved. After all, he was the person who brought China into the global mainstream in 1970s. So it's a very important book in that sense. I would also, I think, recommend Neville Maxwell's India's China War, because I mean, again, it's part of it uses a lot of the documents that Indian governments, successive governments, find very difficult to declassify. But his take on India-China war is very interesting and very important in some ways in shaping a counter narrative. So we are used to looking at, I think ordinary Indians are used to looking at China's war from a particular framework, that we were betrayed and this and that. I think that's a much more engaging book from a different point of view. Then the third book perhaps can be Tanvi. I think Tanvi Madan has a book recently on India, China, and the US, the Strategic Triangle, which is an interesting take on how the 3 countries relate to each other historically. So that might be also interesting.
Thank you so much, sir, for taking your time. I know you're very busy throughout the day, and thank you so much. We can't be more honored so that you could give us some time for the schedule for the interview. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good luck. Thank you.